Hi, everybody. Mr. Unsworth back with you, continuing our mix and our instruction on that with our tune Purgatorio you just heard a little chunk of. Today's focus will be on using compression and comparing that to just what we did last time, which was mostly fader automation plus EQ and panning. So we're going to ask ourselves which instruments in Purgatorio would benefit by applying compression, and how does it work? We're going to zoom in on that choro section that we just heard. So we're going to hear that a bunch of times, which is part of mixing, is listening to sections a lot of times and having patience. So general compressor limiter concepts. What does compression mean? What does compressing mean? It's getting the dynamic range of a track or a song under control. So we're going to sort of push down from the top and push up from the bottom, which is actually compressing the entire dynamic range so that we can control it. And of course that means making the loud signal less present and the soft signal more present. Limiting means sort of just extreme compression, but mostly what it deals with is creating a ceiling for the top end of the dynamic range. So we basically really smash it down. We compress it 10-to-1 ratio or greater. We'll talk about ratio in a second. And of course, once you do that, then you can actually pump up the overall sound of the track or the song. So a compressor should function like a hand on the fader, meaning a very quick amount of movement on the fader that's going to smooth out the dynamics within a performance. And it should definitely help us to make the dynamic range more clear, meaning especially the quieter signal, not necessarily feel louder, but just more present. And of course, compression is only effective when applied in subtle amounts. If you're actually hearing it, if you're hearing the compression working, if it's audible, you're not using it correctly. Well, the first part of this process is to figure out which instruments we're going to try to compress. So we jump over to Pro Tools, and here we have on the green the bass track, which just visually pretty consistent, but I'm going to try to chop off some of these little peaks, see if we can make that thing come out a little better. If you remember from last time, we got, the bass track wasn't recorded as great as some of the other stuff. We're also going to work on the voices. Here we have these 3 tracks. Especially this voice 2 here in red is that's the main vocal track, and you can see it's pretty inconsistent. And then the other thing, if you were listening at the beginning of this video, you heard the flute kind of floating around in this chorus section. Here's the flute track. And we'll try it on that one too. So before we start looking at plugins, the first thing to talk about when it comes to using compression is the threshold control on the device itself, which is controlling the decibel point at which the compressor actually starts working. You don't need it to work on the entire signal. You just want it to start working whenever the loudness gets into a certain point. Some compression devices have fixed threshold points, and they have a knob that's called an input or input gain knob instead of a threshold knob. So we're going to see both types today. Here we have, back to Pro Tools and our edit window. So we have 2 basic plugins that, no frills at all. The first one is this one, Dyne 3 compressor limiter, and the second one is the BF76. And you can see on this one there is no threshold knob. It's just an input and output knobs. So that's a little bit different situation. So we'll talk about that in a second. But your basic compressor has a threshold knob. On this unit we have it in orange. And as you move the knob, you can see the orange line here is moving. if you go way up toward the top, you're going to affect less of the signal. When the signal is straight diagonal, it's not affected. It's just affected at the threshold point. You can see it starts to roll it off at that point. So if you put it way down here, then half or more of the signal is going to be affected. And if you put it way up here, then it's just the very top amount. And that is, so that's the first knob to deal with. So our second most important control knob on a compression unit is the ratio knob. And that control gives us our amount of compression expressed in decibels input to output, like 5:1, 5 input decibels, and the output would be 1 for every 5. And that could be 6:1, 8:1, 10:1, 20:1. And as you get up into 10:1 or higher, we're talking about limiting, so it's an extreme amount of compression. And that is, really important thing to understand how to use. Right here on this device, we have the ratio knob. And if we move our threshold down, you can see I've got the ratio 6.3 to 1. And at that threshold point, this angle occurs, showing us that we are, reducing the output at that point by quite a bit. If we go back to where we had like around 3:1, you can see the angle's not so much. So that means that signal is not affected as much. If we go up to, past 10:1, this is what we're talking about, that hard ceiling, that straight line. And so right at this point, the threshold point, all that signal is really affected. Hopefully that makes sense. And on the other unit, we don't have a threshold knob. We don't have a ratio knob. We don't have a threshold knob either, but we've got the input knob. And the ratio is just a switch. So you got these choices, 4:1, 8:1, 12:1, or 20:1. The last important knob for our purposes, and then we have a few less important knobs also, but the last important one is the gain knob, or on some devices it's called the output. So we can actually boost our low-level signal by raising this knob after we have compressed our louder signal. So once we smash down the top, we can actually push the whole signal up with the gain knob, and what that effectively does is create more presence for the lower level signal. And engineers often call that the makeup gain. On this device, it's just an output knob. On the other one, it is in red here, the gain in decibels. And you can see when I move that, the whole thing, the whole graph goes up. So the first thing we'll do is check out the bass track by itself right now with no compression. To me, like somebody added a little compression when they recorded it, or when they sent these tracks to me on the bass. You can hear it working a little bit there, but we're gonna mess with it anyway. And it's the first one is this Dyne 3 compressor. So I've got it at threshold minus 14.5 decibels, gaining it up by 3.5, and the ratio is 8:1. Let's see what it sounds like with that, with the same track soloed. So now's a good time to talk about one other thing that I didn't mention yet, and that is try to keep subtlety using the attack, release, and the knee knobs. So the other three knobs on this device, you can see here, attack, release, and knee. The knee means you kind of round out that point there where the threshold happens. Instead of having it be a hard angle, it kind of rounds it out so it's a little more subtle. The attack and release for a bass, we want to get them pretty quick because it's all about the finer points of that attack of the instrument. So if you have it attack too slow, it's going to jump in a little too late. So a lot of times we want that attack slow because you won't hear it as much, but in this case it won't do anything unless you get it really pretty quick. And then also on the release, you can mess around with that. I've got it pretty quick right now, 32.5 milliseconds. All right, so we're going to now look at the other tool here. Actually, no, we're going to listen to this one with everything. That compression with the whole band. I like it very much, the way that bass is sitting compared to if you heard it at the beginning of this video. So that's working for me. But let's try the other one. We'll bypass this one. And we'll look at the BF76. Of course, this device is supposed to look like the classic Uri machine that a lot of people have rack mounted in recording studios. Universal audio. So if we bypass that, not bypass, we're going to listen to it with the effect and soloed. So we've got that, the input, I've got it a little bit higher and the output a little bit higher. The attack and release pretty serious, and also the ratio at 8:1. Here it is with everything. So you can see this meter is showing us a lot of gain reduction. It's a little too audible. You have to mess around with it a little bit. It's not quite doing what I want, but this is a plugin that we use a lot on the bass. So now we're going to try to compress our vocal tracks and see if we can bring them out. If you were listening to the last little bounce, the vocal tracks were getting a little buried under everything, so we're going to try to bring them out using this compressor, and also, contain some of the peaks. I've got this Dyne 3 compressor right here on the bus, the voice master bus, and as you can see, the threshold's pretty high, but the ratio is above. It's 12:1. So it's in the limiting area, but it's also only going to affect the voice when it just really comes up into the stronger area. So you can also see on this line the gain reduction. So you'll see whenever it's working. So we're going to solo out our 3 vocal tracks and just check them out as solos. Watch the compressor working.
Un purgatorio en vida sufro. En mi soledad, saber que ya no eres mía, que nunca más estarás junto a mí. Un purgatorio en vida sufro, en mi soledad. Pero si tú sabes que te quiero y hoy me dejas sin consuelo, poco a poco muere mi corazón. Hey.
So the gain is substantial. You can see the graph has been lifted, and that's that's bringing it out without having to deal with the faders. We can just sort of help it to come out there, but we're also compressing once in a while. Just every now and then you saw a little square pop up here and the gain reduction work. So let's now listen to it without that, just to compare. So here it is bypassed.
Un purgatorio en vida sufro en mi soledad, saber que ya no eres mía, que nunca más estarás junto a mí. Un purgatorio en vida sufro en mi soledad, pero si tú sabes que te quiero y hoy me dejas sin consuelo, poco a poco muere mi corazón. Hey!
It's a very different sound. So I'm not sure it's better or worse, but it's obviously not as strong. So it's going to help us in our mix, having that in. So let's listen to the whole track. I've taken out the flute because we're going to deal with that next. But other than that, this is the whole track with that compressor on the vocal.
Un purgatorio en vida sufro en mi soledad, saber que ya no eres mía, que nunca más estarás junto a mí. Un purgatorio en vida sufro en mi soledad, pero si tú sabes que te quiero y hoy me dejas sin consuelo, poco a poco muere mi corazón. Hey!
So now we're on to our last instrument we're going to deal with, and that is the flute, adding it to everything during that choral section. And for this one, I've chosen not to use compression for a couple of reasons. One is that compressors definitely color the sound, and the sound of the flute recording is pretty good. And instead of compressing, I'm going to, actually automate the fader. And here's the line of automation that I've drawn. You can see that, I'm having it sort of cut off those big monster waves there, and then bring it up, when I want it to. So the advantage of this is that you can use your ears and kind of say, okay, I like the little lick he played there. I don't really like that other part. This part, the voice and the flute are conflicting, so let's bring it down. And then also I've kind of got it swelling up because right after this part we got a flute solo happening. So I'm going to let it kind of crescendo. Listen to it now with everybody, all the tracks, and the flute track is here with purple color there, and watch the fader move around as the track goes along, and of course it's going to get into the flute solo, so see if it's effective.
Un purgatorio en vida sufro en mi soledad, saber que ya no eres mía, que nunca más estarás junto a mí. Un purgatorio en vida sufro en mi soledad, pero si tú sabes que te quiero y hoy me dejas sin consuelo, poco a poco muere mi corazón. Hey!
So there we have it. Sounds pretty good. There's a couple of spots that need a little more polish, but generally speaking, we're on the right track. The flute is sitting where I wanted to for the most part. Maybe popped up a little bit too much at the end along with the last vocal shout there, so we got to polish that up, but getting closer. So next week we'll finish up and talk about reverb. This track desperately needs reverb, and we'll focus in on that, some different types of reverb we can try, and also we're going to try adding compression and also EQ to the master fader. Do a bit of a mastering process session as well at the end of our last video.